Inside the U.S. Capitol, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Senator J.D. Vance clash over the nation's most divisive proposal, a bill to grant full legal immunity to over 700,000 police officers. Vance tries to defend the law with statistics and riot footage, framing it as a fight for safety and order. But just minutes later, Crockett flips the entire narrative with chilling evidence that forces the room to face a truth no one came prepared for. If the people sworn to protect us can't be questioned, then who do we turn to when they go too far? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The double doors of room 210 Rayburn House swung open under the weight of history, letting in a blast of camera flashes and hushed tension. Inside, every seat was occupied. Senators, aides, reporters, even retired police chiefs, all arranged like chess pieces in anticipation of war. Outside, the chants were thunderous. On one side, "Blue Lives Matter" screamed over megaphones, accompanied by American flags and uniformed officers standing rigid in silent formation. On the other, haunting signs showing the faces of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Tamir Rice, held aloft by grieving mothers and furious students. Live streams surged across the nation. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a collision of narratives. A nation staring into its own reflection, asking, who do we really protect when we say law and order? At exactly 9 a.m., J.D. Vance rose from his leather-backed chair, posture upright, measured, almost rehearsed. His voice, when it came, was calm, unshaken. He knew what he was about to say would light the room on fire, but he spoke it like gospel. Today, he began, we are taking a stand for every officer who kissed their families goodbye, not knowing if they'd come home. He paused, scanning the room. The National Law Enforcement Immunity Act will ensure that those acting under perceived threat, within the volatile environments they face, will not be destroyed by lawsuits, media attacks, or political witch hunts. His voice thickened with drama. Let me be clear, we are not legalizing violence. We are ending the criminalization of survival. There was a ripple, some nods, some stiff exhales. But Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't look down. She didn't look around. She looked through J.D. Vance, as if she'd been waiting years for this moment and had memorized every inch of his rhetoric. She rose slowly, no notes, no binder, just memory, and something deeper. Witness. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried with the weight of funerals and courtroom benches and hospital hallways. What you just proposed, she said, steady but firm, is not about protection. It is about erasure. Her tone didn't rise, but the room tilted around her words. You've written a bill that gives the state permission to kill, and not just kill, but to never be questioned, never be named, never be held accountable. J.D. shifted in his seat, slight but noticeable. Jasmine stepped forward, one hand on the witness table, eyes burning now, not with rage, but with control. This isn't law. This is legalized fear. Fear aimed like a weapon at people who look like me, live where I come from, and don't get second chances when officers feel threatened. Her voice cracked, only once, just enough to prove she was still human beneath the armor. This isn't about bad cops. This is about dangerous silence. The room held still. Even the cameraman stopped moving. You could hear the fluorescent lights buzz. J.D. Vance offered a half smile. Not of victory, but of deflection. Like a man who thought he still held the room, even as it quietly slipped through his fingers. But Jasmine didn't take her eyes off him. And in that silence, in that fixed stare, you could feel it. She knew something he didn't. Something deeper than politics, louder than slogans. Something that was coming, something ready to break. And that's where it began. The silence was short-lived. J.D. Vance, unshaken by Jasmine's searing rebuke, moved with the precision of a man who didn't believe he'd been challenged, only interrupted. Without a word, he tapped the embedded control panel in front of him. The lights dimmed just enough to shift the atmosphere from debate to demonstration. A large screen behind the dais flickered on, casting grainy shadows across the polished floor. Let's be honest about what our officers are facing, he said, standing straighter, his tone sharper, colder. The first frame cut in, Atlanta, 2021. An officer, overwhelmed and outnumbered, stumbling backward as a bottle crashes against his riot shield. A second video, Seattle, 2020. A patrol car surrounded, its windows shattered, the driver dragged out, kicking, screaming, disappearing under a blur of fists. The footage was unfiltered, brutal, no narration, just raw noise. Sirens, glass, rage. JD let the room absorb it before he spoke again. In the last 5 years, he said, his voice low but slicing, 1,423 officers have faced lawsuits for decisions made in the field. 276 have resigned, not because they were convicted, not because they broke the law, but because they were buried under the weight of public backlash and legal ambiguity. He stepped away from the podium, walking slowly along the bench. When did we decide that survival was a crime? When did we decide that doing your job means signing your own indictment? His hand gestured toward the screen as another clip played. This one of an officer bleeding from his scalp, clutching his weapon like a last breath. This isn't about corruption. It's about clarity. Officers need to know that if they react in a split second to save their lives, their country won't throw them to the wolves. Some heads nodded, a few fists clenched. The room didn't cheer, but it shifted. JD had struck a chord, and he knew it. We are watching the slow erosion of authority, he added. We're watching good men and women hesitate because they've seen what happens when the mob edits context and the courtroom follows Twitter. We've turned body cams into execution warrants. Every decision is judged in hindsight, every command second-guessed by people who've never had to stand between a bullet and a child. He looked back at Jasmine for the first time since he began. We cannot survive as a country that eats its protectors alive. Jasmine didn't blink. Her expression didn't shift. But behind the stillness, something was forming. Not retaliation, revelation. She wasn't shaken by the images. She had seen worse, lived through worse. What pierced her wasn't the video, but the selective outrage. How pain was only validated when worn in uniform. The families she knew didn't have screens to play their suffering. No montage, no statistics, just names etched on sidewalks and whispered in courtrooms, always accompanied by the phrase, "Officer acted appropriately." And as JD turned back to his seat, head held high like a general who believed he'd just won the first battle, Jasmine never looked away. Because she understood. The louder he played the footage, the more desperate he was to cover up the truth. And the truth was still coming. When the final image on JD Vance's screen dissolved into darkness, the silence that followed wasn't victory, it was vacuum. The air felt thinner, the room smaller, as if the footage had drained all oxygen. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved. And what she said next didn't just cut through the silence, it shattered it. She didn't rise, she didn't flinch. She only tilted her head slightly and folded her hands on the desk, her voice calm, deliberate, surgical. "Senator Vance," she began, her tone flat but razor sharp, "do you by any chance have a video queued up of a police officer kneeling on the neck of an unarmed man for 9 minutes and 29 seconds? She didn't blink. She didn't need to. Her words hit the room like a jolt of electricity, not raised but precise, cutting through the echo of JD's curated images with something far more potent. Unfiltered truth. No names were needed. Everyone knew exactly what she meant. The moment, the man, the death that had split this country's conscience like a fault line. No one spoke. Not even JD. A ripple passed through the hearing room, but it wasn't the kind of ripple JD had summoned with statistics or shock footage. This one felt human, raw and rupturing. On the left side of the chamber, someone let out a sharp exhale. On the right, a congressional aide abruptly stopped typing. One man shifted in his seat and stared hard at the wood grain on the table, as if avoiding her gaze would soften the weight of her question. But nothing softened it, because Jasmine hadn't just responded, she had reframed the battlefield. Her words weren't argument, they were indictment, and in them was the cold, unrelenting memory of a knee, a sidewalk, a voice begging for air, and a nation that watched. No one applauded right away. They didn't need to. The silence itself felt like judgment. Then quietly at first came the sound of a single hand clapping, slow, steady, defiant. Another followed, and then more. But this wasn't celebration. It was grief weaponized, a controlled eruption of anguish disguised as recognition. You could feel it in the rhythm. This wasn't about politics anymore. This was about a man who died while the system watched. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't nod. She stayed where she was, hands still folded, her gaze steady, because she hadn't said it for applause. She'd said it because someone had to put the truth back on the record, in the one room where it always seemed to go missing. And now it was there, and no one could look away. The silence that followed Jasmine's question wasn't just silence, it was submission. No one had an answer. No one dared pretend they did. But Jasmine didn't let the silence rest. She turned it into something heavier, remembrance. She tapped her tablet gently, and the screen above the committee chamber changed. Not to footage, not to statistics, but to 12 still portraits. One by one they appeared. 12 faces, 12 human lives. A 9-year-old boy with eyes too big for his face and a smile that looked drawn in crayon. A teenage girl in a prom dress, her curls pinned with care. A 26-year-old EMT in uniform, soft-eyed and radiant. A 48-year-old father sitting at a barbecue table, laughing mid-bite. Each image stark against a white background. No borders, no filters, just names, ages, and 3 final words beneath each one. No charges filed. The screen held them, not as evidence, but as memory. They weren't suspects. They weren't statistics. They were casualties of silence. Jasmine's voice cut through the stillness, not sharp, but deliberate, restrained by force. This, she said, is the America my communities live in. These are the people I carry with me every time I walk into this building. These are the people your bill erases, before the ink even dries. Her tone didn't tremble, but there was something frayed in the edges, the kind of pain too deep to theatricalize. She moved to the next slide. The photo that came up showed only a school hallway, no face, just a hoodie on the floor, a spilled water bottle near a locker. This child, she said, and now her voice cracked just once, was 11. His name was David Hill. He was playing outside. An officer mistook the bottle in his hand for a weapon and fired before David could turn around. She stepped slightly away from the microphone, as if trying to hold herself together. Then she returned, sharper than before. I was his legal advocate. I sat beside his mother while they justified her son's death with the word protocol. I held her hand when the court ruled no criminal liability. I watched her break into pieces when they handed her a final report that used terms like incident, miscommunication, and reasonable force. Her gaze swept the room now, not as confrontation, but as burden. There was no trial, no indictment, no press conference. The officer kept his badge. My client buried her son in the same clothes he wore to school that morning. The screen remained lit, David's empty hallway casting a faint glow across the panelists' faces. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't break. You want to protect officers from fear, she said. But who protects us when fear pulls the trigger? Who rewinds the moment when judgment fails and someone's baby never comes home again? Her final words hung suspended, quiet but immovable. This isn't about your intentions. It's about your impact. And if you pass this bill, you're not protecting America. You're protecting the license to destroy it, one unarmed life at a time. The image of David's school hallway still glowed faintly behind them, a silent witness to the weight of what had just been said. But J.D. Vance leaned forward, his voice breaking the stillness, not with apology, but justification. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The calm in his tone carried something colder than volume, certainty. They ran, he said, folding his hands neatly in front of him, as if reciting a verdict rather than offering a defense. They fit the profile. They match the call-outs. In the field, officers don't get to pause and analyze. They get a flash of movement, a shape in the dark, and the knowledge that it might be their last moment. That's not bias, it's survival. His eyes swept the room, calculated but unshaken. We can't expect perfection in split seconds. We can't ask our officers to be clairvoyant. We can only ask them to go home alive. And yes, Sometimes that means acting before they're certain. For a few seconds, the only sound in the chamber was the quiet tap of a pen dropped by a stunned aide. JD sat back, satisfied. To him, that sounded like reason. To Jasmine, it sounded like a eulogy in legalese. She didn't reply immediately. She let the words settle like dust, suffocating, fine, and everywhere. Then she stood again. Not slowly this time, but with purpose, as if her body itself was rejecting what it had just heard. "Senator Vance," she began, her voice steady but ice-edged, "what you've just described isn't instinct. It's programming. Programming that trains an entire system to see danger in brown skin, threat in baggy clothes, and justification in fear." She stepped closer to the microphone. "You say they match the profile. Whose profile? Written by whom? Built from what bias? You say they ran. But tell me, when a child sees a gun pointed at him by someone who has the legal right to shoot, what else is he supposed to do?" Her eyes swept the room, not rhetorically but personally, measuring who could meet her gaze. "You've made fear into law. You've made appearance into probable cause. And now you want to make that permanent." Her voice didn't break, it hardened. "What you're proposing is not the protection of life. It is the protection of the perception of danger. Danger that always seems to wear black skin." She took one final breath, the kind that carries too many funerals in its lungs. "This isn't about making officers safer. It's about making them unaccountable when they're wrong. And they have been wrong. Over and over and over again." There was no applause, no gasp, just that sharp, unbearable stillness, the kind that happens right before something breaks. Jasmine's words still hung in the air like broken glass, but before anyone could respond, before JD could summon another defense or twist the language of fear into policy, a door at the rear of the chamber opened and the room turned. She walked in slowly, not because she was weak, but because the weight she carried refused to be rushed. Latrice Daniels, dressed in quiet black, moved down the center aisle of the hearing room as if she were walking through the final stretch of a long funeral. In her hands, she held no signs, no prepared remarks, only a folded photo worn soft at the edges, like it had been held too many times by shaking hands. The chair reserved for public witnesses sat vacant at the end of the bench, and when she took her seat, no one needed a title to know who she was. Her name was already whispered across social media and scrawled across protest posters nationwide. Her son, Malik Daniels, had been 13, and he was dead. A staffer handed her a microphone. She didn't test it. She didn't ask if people could hear her. She looked down at the photo in her hands, Malik in a yellow shirt, his smile cocky, his eyes wide with the kind of mischief 13-year-olds are supposed to survive. "My son was playing outside our apartment," she said, voice low, words wrapped in exhaustion so deep it felt like it had hollowed her out. "He had a toy gun, orange tip and everything. It was 2 days after Christmas." Her fingers tightened around the photo. "The police said they got a report of a suspicious male with a weapon. They pulled up. They yelled. Malik turned. They shot him twice. He was gone before the ambulance got there." She didn't cry. The tears had dried long ago. Now there was only ash where a voice used to be. She looked up, and for a moment her gaze landed on JD Vance, not with accusation, but with absence. "They called it a tactical misjudgment," she said. "A training lapse. They told me it was understandable, given the circumstances." Her voice didn't shake. That would have been a mercy. Instead, it sharpened into something raw. "What part of my son's death was understandable? The way he fell? The way I wasn't allowed to hold him at the scene?" She shook her head slowly. "They said the officers followed procedure, that their actions were consistent with protocol, that no one would be charged, because they feared for their safety." The words came bitter now, each one scraped from a place that had never healed. "Do you know what it's like to sit in a courtroom and be told your child's life wasn't worth a jury's time?" A single sob broke from somewhere in the back of the room, but Latrice didn't stop. "They asked if he had been involved in any gang activity. He was 13. He still slept with the hallway light on. He used to beg me to check the closet before bed." She paused and swallowed hard. "They never asked me what kind of kid he was." They never asked what his laugh sounded like. All they saw was a boy with dark skin holding something that looked like a gun. And that was enough. The photo trembled now in her grip. That's what fear does when it wears a badge. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't wait for truth. It pulls the trigger and lets the lawyers explain it away. J.D. Vance didn't lift his eyes. He stared down at the desk, expression unreadable, hands clasped tighter than before. The silence surrounding him wasn't merciful. It was damning. For the first time that morning, he had no facts to cite, no footage to project, no legal principle to spin. Because sitting less than 20 feet from him was a mother whose son had been mistaken for a threat and executed for it. And the law he was defending would have made sure no one ever had to say sorry. Jasmine Crockett sat beside Latrice, unmoving, her shoulders squared as if absorbing the weight that had just entered the room. Then, quietly with no spectacle, she reached out and placed a hand on Latrice's shoulder. It wasn't for the cameras. It wasn't for effect. It was for her. It was for every Black woman who had to bury a child and then be told they were overreacting. The two women didn't exchange words. They didn't need to. There was an understanding in that silence deeper than language, an acknowledgement of grief that the system refused to carry. The chair of the committee, Senator Harlan Royce, cleared his throat and began to say something procedural, something about time limits and record entries. But the words caught in his throat. He looked around the room and saw the faces, some stricken, some hollow, some avoiding eye contact entirely. Even the aides had stopped typing. Even the cameras seemed quieter. The room was holding its breath, not out of respect, but out of confrontation. Because in that moment, no one could pretend anymore. No one could hide behind statistical outliers or policy disagreements. Malik wasn't a policy. He was a child, and he was dead. Latrice set the photo gently on the table in front of her and pushed it forward until it sat at the very edge. It faced the committee directly. "You can pass your law," she said finally. "You can say it'll save lives, but don't lie to yourselves. You're not protecting officers. You're protecting the right to never say, 'We were wrong.'" Her voice faded, but not the words. "You want to make it legal to fear someone like my son, and I need you to know he was scared too." The chair didn't respond. JD didn't look up, and for a full 30 seconds, no one moved. Not because they didn't want to, but because no one knew how to go back to normal after that. And maybe that was the point. Maybe normal was the problem all along. Jasmine's hand remained on Latrice's shoulder as the screen behind them dimmed to black, but the faces stayed, the stories stayed, and in that stillness, something permanent settled over the room. Not a policy, not a vote, but truth. And truth in that room was heavier than law. The weight of Latrice Daniels' testimony still lingered like smoke in a sealed room. But J.D. Vance, unwilling to let that moment define the hearing, reached not for reason, but for retaliation. And with one calculated gesture, he tried to rewrite the narrative. He tapped a button on his monitor, and the overhead screen flickered to life again. Not with evidence, but with a political trap. The grainy footage began without introduction. Jasmine Crockett stood atop a concrete planter, a bullhorn in one hand, the roar of a crowd behind her. It was June 2020, Dallas, a protest march. Her voice echoed over the crowd, firm, resolute, alive with fury earned the hard way. "We will not bow anymore, not to fear, not to power, not to anyone who sees our lives as disposable." A pause, then cheers. The screen froze. Jasmine mid-sentence, her fist raised, the crowd swelling behind her like a tide. J.D. Vance let the image linger. He stood slowly, turning back to the room, his voice as controlled as it was weaponized. "Let's stop pretending," he began. "This is not a voice of reason. This is not a voice of law. This is the voice of unrest." His tone didn't rise, but it hardened, shifting from argument to indictment. That clip wasn't taken in a courtroom, or a hearing, or on the House floor. That was taken in the middle of a protest that would, within hours, become a riot. Broken windows, fires, officers injured, and there she was, our colleague, at the center of it. His hand gestured lightly toward Jasmine, as if offering her to the room. We're told she stands for accountability. What I see is a woman who stood on a pile of anger and told people to stop respecting the rule of law. A few heads turned, a few eyes lowered. He wasn't shouting, but each sentence was sharpened like a knife. You didn't come here to legislate, Congresswoman Crockett. You came here to finish what you started in the streets. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was chilling, not because of what had been said, but because of what had been attempted. JD hadn't answered the question. He hadn't acknowledged Malik. He hadn't denied the pain. Instead, he had reached back 4 years to cast a shadow over Jasmine's voice. He had taken a moment of protest, born from injustice, forged in grief, and tried to frame it as proof that her passion disqualified her, that anger discredited morality, that defiance meant disloyalty. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't shift in her seat or drop her gaze, because she knew what this was. She had seen it before. They didn't fear the clip. They feared what it stood for. A black woman, unafraid to speak without permission, unapologetic in her fight, and JD, for all his poise, had just shown his hand. When stripped of facts, of policy, of legal ground, he resorted to the thing systems always do when truth becomes inconvenient. They criminalized dissent. JD's words were still settling like dust over old marble. But before they could root, Jasmine rose, not in defense, not in anger, but in something far more dangerous to the comfort of that room. Clarity. She stood slowly, deliberately, her chair gliding back with the low scrape of steel on polished floor. A sound small but unmistakable in a room suddenly far too quiet. Her movement wasn't reaction, it was conviction made physical. She didn't rush, didn't adjust her blazer, didn't glance at any notes. She didn't need to. Jasmine Crockett moved toward the center of the chamber like a woman walking through smoke she had survived, carrying names J.D. Vance's legislation would rather forget. Her heels struck the floor in steady rhythm, each step a syllable of the truth she was about to deliver. The cameras adjusted reflexively, zeroing in on her face. It was unreadable, except for the eyes. They burned, not wildly, precisely. And when she finally stopped, framed by the seal of the committee behind her and the nation watching in breathless silence, she spoke. I didn't come here to make speeches, she said, voice quiet but lined with steel. I didn't come here to relitigate my past or defend a protest or silence grief with protocol. Her gaze slid slowly toward JD. I came here because your laws, the ones you defend with such polished detachment, have placed children in graves without trial, without warning, without even a name spoken in court. Her words struck not like punches, but like verdicts. Your bill doesn't protect peace, it permits silence. It makes death procedural. It legalizes the moment after the trigger is pulled, when the paperwork begins and the humanity disappears. Someone in the gallery shifted, the leather of their chair creaking under tension. In the far back, a journalist lowered his pen, no longer writing, just watching. The air was static now, every molecule waiting for what she would say next. You say I bring the street into this chamber, Jasmine continued. You're damn right I do. Because the street is where Malik died, where Davin died, where names we'll never even hear died, and none of them were invited here to defend themselves. She stepped forward a half inch. But I was. Another beat. Her voice dropped, but the room leaned in, as if gravity had turned sideways. You want to call me extreme? Go ahead. Radical? Fine. But don't pretend that civility ever kept our children alive. Her lips barely moved, but the words poured like flame from behind her teeth. I came here because what you call order looks a lot like a loaded gun when you're black. Because what you call reasonable fear gets mistaken for law when you write it down. Because your policies don't come with accountability, they come with funerals. At that moment, the room wasn't a hearing. It was a courtroom, a reckoning. Jasmine didn't need to yell. Her restraint was the indictment. She turned slightly, addressing the rest of the chamber, not with politics, but presence. I am not here because I'm fearless, she said. I'm here because I've seen what happens when no one is. And I refuse to sit quietly while you turn fear into legislation and call it justice. Her final glance was not toward JD, but toward the wall of names still burned into memory. And for a long moment, no one said anything. Because what she just delivered wasn't a rebuttal. It was a truth so complete, no one dared touch it. The room was still reeling from Jasmine's blistering indictment of immunity as legalized silence. But what came next wasn't just words, it was evidence. Not opinion, not theory. It was the anatomy of a system engineered to prey. She didn't hesitate. She reached into the folder before her and pulled out a set of printed emails, their headers unmistakable, their dates recent. She held them up, one in each hand, then placed them under the document camera. The screen behind her came alive. Subject: Strategic Enforcement Zones. Development Alignment Proposal. The silence that followed was different this time. Cold, bureaucratic, afraid. This email, Jasmine began, her voice taut with controlled urgency, was sent from the leadership of the Burnett Police Department in Texas to precinct captains last February. It outlines a strategy to, quote, increase randomized stops and patrols in economically challenged minority neighborhoods to preemptively stabilize perception for potential investors. She let the words sit in the air like smoke from a slow fire. No one dared speak. They weren't reducing crime. They were reshaping optics, not for safety, for profit. She clicked to the next page. Now the screen displayed a scanned contract, 7 pages, all initialed, all signed. Jasmine pointed to the seal in the corner. Wyland Urban Equity Fund. This, she said with slow, deliberate cadence, is a formal revenue-sharing agreement between Burnett PD and a private investment group. It awards financial bonuses to the department based on monthly arrest quotas within designated redevelopment corridors. She looked up. And those corridors, they just happen to overlap almost perfectly with neighborhoods that are 90% black and brown, with average annual incomes under $30,000. Her voice was unwavering now. We're not talking about enforcement. We're talking about targeting. Targeting for money. Targeting with incentives to remove bodies so buildings can go up faster. The tension in the room became suffocating. One senator shifted uncomfortably. A lobbyist in the back scribbled notes with shaking hands. J.D. Vance didn't look up. Jasmine didn't need him to. She turned back to the screen. The bonuses were tiered. $500 for drug-related arrests, $1,000 for firearms, $200 for misdemeanors, but only if they occurred in the high-priority zones. These weren't patrols. They were fishing expeditions with human beings as the catch. Her words were tight, unapologetic, deadly accurate. And let's be clear, she said, voice hardening. The more arrests they made, the more grants were unlocked for so-called community projects. Projects that somehow never benefited the communities being policed. She stepped away from the podium and let the documents linger behind her. Black text, white background. Nothing dramatic, just the machinery of structural racism laid bare. This is what happens when fear becomes policy, when neighborhoods become zones, when citizens become quotas. Her eyes scanned the room slowly, voice softer now, but twice as lethal. And now you want to give immunity to the very officers who carried this out. You want to shield them, not only from consequence, but from the truth. Another pause. Well, now the truth is on the record. Try scrubbing that from your conscience. No one moved, not a cough, not a whisper. The chamber was locked in the weight of it, proof undeniable, purpose unshaken. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She had just dismantled the illusion of neutrality with documents signed in ink and built on silence. The documents still glowed on the screen behind Jasmine. Inked signatures, line items, corporate logos, undeniable proof of systemic exploitation. The silence that followed was absolute. And then J.D. Vance, cornered, exposed, broke it the only way power knows how, with denial. His voice came sharp and forceful, like a man trying to extinguish a fire with volume alone. This is a local issue, he snapped, rising halfway out of his seat. His hand struck the table, not hard enough to startle, but hard enough to demand notice. One precinct, one department. This doesn't represent the entire justice system. His tone teetered between outrage and disbelief, as if he couldn't decide whether to feign ignorance or double down on authority. You're painting with a brush dipped in sensationalism. You're trying to indict the entire institution based on one error. The words spilled too fast, each one a fracture in his control. It's not policy, he insisted. It's a deviation, a failure in oversight. Don't twist a single misstep into a national narrative. But the room didn't move with him. No one echoed his words. The senators remained still. The staffers didn't blink. The cameras didn't pan away. J.D. Vance's voice had risen, but it had failed to land. Because what he called a misstep, everyone else had seen for what it was, a mirror, a system reflected perfectly in a single act of strategy and funding. And Jasmine Crockett, she didn't even need to raise her tone. That was the real threat. She stepped forward, eyes fixed on him, not with hostility, but with the devastating calm of someone who had heard these deflections 1,000 times and buried too many children beneath them. Her voice was quiet, but every syllable landed like a sentence. If you didn't know, she said, her words heavy with restrained fury, if this email, this contract, this grotesque partnership between capital and force somehow escaped your attention, then you are too uninformed, too removed, too unqualified to shape legislation that governs the lives of people you clearly don't understand. She let that hang, not as rhetoric, but as diagnosis. Then, without flinching, she delivered the blow that no amount of indignation could absorb. But if you did know, if you saw the quotas, the bonuses, the maps designed to erase neighborhoods, and still chose to defend it here, today, then you are not just a bystander. She leaned into the microphone now, not for volume, but for precision. You are a participant. You are not protecting the law. You are laundering exploitation through it. There was no noise after that. No gavel, no rebuttal. Just the sound of a room realizing that the woman they tried to label as radical had just delivered the clearest definition of complicity anyone had ever dared speak. And she had done it without raising her voice once. The chamber had gone still, every breath waiting on what might come next. But the threat no longer came from inside the room. It stood outside, pressed in against the walls like a quiet army. And everyone knew it. Through the reinforced glass windows lining the rear of the hearing room, the crowd could be seen gathering in formation. Hundreds of uniformed officers, lined shoulder to shoulder across the Capitol steps, stood in perfect silence, their presence heavy and unmistakably intentional. Each held a flag, not the stars and stripes, but banners emblazoned in dark blue with bold block lettering, "Protect the Blue." They didn't chant. They didn't move. They didn't need to. Their stillness said everything. It was not a protest. It was a statement. "We're watching." Inside, a staffer moved quietly toward the dais and handed a folded memo to the committee chair. The paper trembled slightly in the man's hands. He read it, swallowed hard, and passed it down the line without a word. The letter marked "Confidential," Office of the Ohio State Police, was clear. If public disrespect and vilification of law enforcement continues within this chamber, this department will initiate emergency withdrawal of personnel from non-essential civic zones, effective immediately. A tactical reshuffling cloaked in bureaucratic calm, but the message was unmistakable. Comply or lose control. J.D. Vance seized the moment like a general who had just heard reinforcements arrive. He rose with force this time, the gravity of the officers outside fusing with his voice. "This is what happens when you push too far," he began, his eyes scanning the room like a man who believed he'd just won without firing a shot. "If we continue down this road of demonizing law enforcement, stripping them of the right to act, to decide, to survive, we are going to lose them." He pointed to the window, where the silhouettes of helmets and flags remain motionless. "And when they're gone, who will answer that 911 call? Who will stand between chaos and your home? You want to talk about systems, but when the system walks out the door, what do you have left?" His voice rose, trembling on the edge of righteous indignation. "Order doesn't sustain itself. It is protected by people who are now being told they are the enemy." Jasmine waited until the room had soaked in every word. She didn't respond immediately because she understood what had just been attempted. Fear had walked into the hearing, dressed in uniform, weaponized as leverage. And JD, like so many before him, had mistaken that fear for an argument. Then she stood slowly, with the same calm that had guided every truth she'd delivered all day. Her voice came low, but the silence around it sharpened every syllable. "Senator Vance, you keep asking who will protect us," she said, "but you never ask who we need protection from." The words sliced through the tension like a scalpel. Her eyes didn't shift. "Let me help you. We need protection from people who believe their badge makes them untouchable, from departments who assign value to bodies based on their zip code, from a culture that punishes protest but funds silence." She stepped closer to the center of the room, now facing the entire committee. "You say officers are leaving because they feel disrespected. But what do you say to the mothers who buried their children without a trial, without a charge, without even an apology?" Her voice stayed level, but there was an unmistakable fire beneath it. "You talk about who will answer the call. I want to know who will answer for the calls that went wrong, when the sirens brought not safety, but death." She turned slowly, back to JD. The moment hung there, electric, poised. "You're not asking the wrong question because you're confused," she said. "You're asking it because the real question terrifies you. A beat. Not who will protect us, but who holds the protectors accountable." And in that moment, with hundreds of silent officers outside and one woman standing alone inside, the balance of power didn't belong to the uniforms. It belonged to the truth, and the one voice unafraid to speak it. Outside, the silent wall of officers stood like stone. Inside, fear had been wrapped in flags and handed a microphone. But Jasmine hadn't come to be outnumbered. She had come prepared. And now it was time for the room to hear what power says when it thinks no one's listening. She reached into her folder with the quiet precision of a surgeon. No performance, no preamble, just movement born of certainty. She slid a small audio device across the table, tapped the side, and spoke one sentence. "I'd like to enter this into the record." A soft click followed, then static, then silence, and then a voice filled the room. Unmistakable, clear, recorded without his knowledge but now echoing off the walls like a confession written in glass. "If they believe cops can't be sued, they'll stop rioting. Order will restore itself. People settle down when they feel powerless. J.D. Vance." In his own voice, no edits, no questions. Just a strategy session turned revelation, broadcast to a room that had run out of excuses. Gasps rolled through the chamber like a wave cresting on marble. Chairs shifted, pens paused midair. JD's jaw tightened as the recording continued, each syllable damning, clinical, devoid of empathy. It wasn't a slip, it was design. Jasmine let it play for 8 more seconds, long enough to burn into the ears of every senator, journalist, and staffer in the room. Then with a single press, the recording stopped. The silence afterward was not stunned. It was surgical. A silence that knew it was in the presence of something undeniable. J.D. Vance, visibly pale, leaned forward with both hands on the table like a man clinging to a vanishing edge. "That quote is taken out of context," he said, voice hollow, stripped of its former thunder. "It was a theoretical discussion, not policy. It wasn't—" His words fell apart mid-sentence. Even he could hear it, the sound of a defense already rotting. Jasmine didn't rush. She waited, as if allowing the weight of the tape to fully sink in. Then she stepped forward, measured, steady, her heels quiet on the floor but louder than any gavel. She approached the mic and leaned in, not to shout, but to clarify. Her voice came low, exact, and unflinching. "Order," she said, "is not the silence of a man with a knee on his neck." Every eye turned to her. It is not the absence of protest bought by fear. It is not what happens when people stop screaming because they've given up hope that anyone will listen. She drew breath, then continued, each word heavier than the last. "Real order is a balance, a contract, between authority and responsibility, between power and restraint, between the right to act and the obligation to answer for it." JD didn't look up. His shoulders had slumped slightly, the posture of someone who had planned for a fight, but not for a reckoning. Jasmine didn't let the moment pass. When you strip away the right to question the enforcers of law, she continued, you don't create peace. You create a pressure cooker. You build a nation of quiet resentments and loud graves. You turn the law into a cage, not for criminals, but for the people it was meant to protect. A murmur rippled across the back row. Someone whispered, God, under their breath. But Jasmine kept going, not louder, just deeper. If your vision of public safety requires silencing the very people being policed, then what you're building isn't a society, it's submission wrapped in blue. She paused now, the chamber once again breathless. Her voice never cracked, never rose, but the tremor in the room was seismic. Don't tell me this was just theory, she said finally, her tone sharpened to a point. Don't insult this room, or the families watching this hearing, by pretending that kind of language doesn't become policy when spoken behind closed doors. She turned to face the rest of the committee now. That recording is not a one-off. It is a doctrine, one that sees pain as a PR problem, protest as a flaw in the algorithm of power. Then she looked directly at JD, her expression unreadable but firm. And if your answer to protest is, make them feel powerless, then what you're really afraid of isn't disorder. A pause. It's justice with a voice. The room didn't breathe. The windows didn't move. And in the quiet that followed, even the officers outside seemed to shift uneasily. Because truth, once spoken, can't be unrecorded. And Jasmine had just played it back for the world to hear. The moment the audio faded, replaced by silence so tense it could splinter bone, everyone knew. The hearing was no longer about opinion. It was about legacy. And the vote would carve it in stone. The gavel didn't slam. It hovered, symbolic, as the committee chair cleared his throat. We now move to a roll call vote on H.R. 2741. The National Law Enforcement Immunity Act, he announced, his voice gravelly with the weight of history. The room didn't breathe. Reporters hunched over their keyboards like snipers. Aides gripped legal pads they hadn't written on in an hour. Jasmine sat perfectly still, her fingers interlaced in front of her, as if holding back the tide of every mother, father, and child she'd ever stood beside in courtrooms that had chosen silence over justice. Senator Carlson? Nay. Senator Dubois? Aye. One by one, names were called, and each answer rang out like the ticking of a bomb about to decide whose truth mattered more, Powers or the people's. Then came a pause, an unplanned, oxygen-thieving pause. Senator Richard Weems, a lifelong conservative from Ohio, didn't answer. He looked down at his phone. The camera zoomed in as his thumb trembled over the screen. He tapped, waited, then to everyone's confusion, raised the phone to his ear and whispered, Hey, baby, real quick, just tell me one thing. Do you feel safe? His daughter's voice couldn't be heard, but something in his face changed. It wasn't political, it was paternal, a crack in armor. He exhaled, heavy and real, then lowered the phone, placed it beside the mic, and said, Nay. The room didn't move. For a second, no one even understood. Then the tally hit the screen behind the panel. 11-10. Motion fails. A silent gasp passed like wind through the chamber. J.D. Vance's jaw flexed, then slackened. His hands were clenched at his sides, but his eyes betrayed it. He hadn't prepared for this. He stood slowly like a man recovering from a body blow, and without a single word turned and walked toward the exit. No one stopped him. The cameras followed, hoping for a flinch, a snarl, a last-minute play for narrative redemption. But he offered nothing, not even a backward glance. Just the hollow, unmistakable retreat of a man who had lost not just a vote, but control of the story. Inside, the chamber remained suspended in a strange gravity. Jasmine didn't gloat. There was no fist raised, no dramatic line waiting to go viral. She didn't even smile. Instead, she turned her head to the third row of the audience, where a woman in a simple navy blouse was weeping quietly, her hand pressed against her lips, the other clutching a crumpled photograph of a boy in a red hoodie. Malik, 13 years old, shot for holding a toy. Jasmine met her eyes, and for a heartbeat, the entire country watched two women grieve in unison, one for a son buried too soon, the other for every courtroom that never heard his name. Jasmine rose, walked a few steps to the railing, and placed her hand over her heart. Not in victory, but in mourning. A quiet nod. That was all, but it was enough. Enough to tell every mother watching at home that their pain hadn't been erased, that someone inside those halls of power had seen them, had fought for them, and had won, not with rage, not with revenge, but with truth sharper than any law and steadier than any gavel. As JD disappeared beyond the heavy oak doors, the silence he left behind didn't feel like relief. It felt like pressure building in the heart of a nation split at its seams. Outside the Capitol, sirens wailed, not in alarm, but in surrender. Rows of uniformed officers began to retreat, stepping back from the perimeters they had guarded all day, their faces unreadable behind visors. They moved in silent coordination, holstering batons, silencing radios, and dissolving into waiting cruisers. Blue and red lights swirled across the night like a dying storm. A few protesters flinched, unsure if it was a trick, but the realization slowly rippled outward. They weren't being pushed anymore. The wall had pulled back. They had held the line. And in its place, thousands of tiny flames flickered into being. Candles lifted by hands shaking from exhaustion, from disbelief, from years of not being seen. Mothers held pictures. Fathers clutched shirts that no longer had owners. Young men stood with lips pressed shut but eyes burning wide open. The night air thickened with smoke, sweat, and something sacred. The moment grief finally outlasted fear. Cameras swung in wide arcs over the scene. Drones hummed overhead. The anchors on every major network scrambled to reframe the narrative. Historic upset. Crockett halts qualified immunity bill. Congress rocked by narrow defeat. But one headline landed harder than the rest. CNN's Chiron bled across the bottom of every TV in the country. Crockett wins, but America divides. It was more than a summary. It was a warning. The fracture wasn't new, but now it had a face, a voice, and a final word still echoing through marble halls. Inside, under the rotunda, Jasmine Crockett stepped in front of the podium. No teleprompter, no talking points. Just her, the seal of Congress behind her, and the nation watching. The crowd, journalists, clerks, aides, families, activists, fell silent. Even the security guards paused, their radios off, hands behind their backs. Her voice cut through the hush like glass. I need to make something clear. I'm not anti-police. I never have been. She let it hang, sharp, pointed, defiant. I'm anti-power without accountability. I'm against badges being used as shields for impunity. I'm against laws that punish the powerless and protect the protected. Every syllable was delivered not with anger, but with precision, like a scalpel. Not a scream, but a reckoning. A civilized society isn't measured by how many people it arrests, she continued, but by whether people trust the law enough to seek it, not fear it. She reached for the candle someone had placed on the steps beside her. A vigil left burning for Malik, for Tamir, for Brianna, for all the names that had become hashtags before they could finish high school. She held it in both hands. I want every officer who risks their life for this country to know. I respect you, but respect without scrutiny is worship. And we're not here to worship men with guns. We're here to protect the Constitution that governs everyone, even them. The camera panned slowly, capturing the sea of faces, some tearful, others stunned, many simply overwhelmed. A mother in the front row clutched her chest. A young man held up a hand-drawn sign that read, "We are worth protecting too." Across the country, living rooms fell silent. Bars turned down their music. In cities and suburbs and forgotten corners of America, people leaned in, holding their breath. Then Jasmine looked directly into the lens. Not past it, not through it, into it. Her final words were not shouted. They were steady, ice cold, iron heavy. No one wearing a uniform has the right to stand above the law. Not the man with a badge. Not the man with a gun. Not the man who claims to kill in the name of peace. Because when justice bows to fear, what we're protecting isn't society, it's control. And control without justice. She narrowed her eyes slightly. Isn't protection, it's tyranny. She stepped back. The microphone crackled and went dead. But no one moved. It wasn't a speech. It was a line in the concrete. A boundary drawn, not in chalk, but in blood and belief. The media rushed to name it, the Crockett Doctrine, a sentence that lit up Twitter, a quote replayed across every cable channel, a moment that would be studied in law schools, shouted in protests, and whispered in patrol cars at shift change. But for Jasmine, it wasn't doctrine. It was defense. For the voiceless, for the silenced, for the next 11-year-old who didn't get a courtroom. Outside, the candles still burned. They would keep burning, long after the cameras turned off, long after the officers went home, and long after the votes were tallied. Because tonight, a woman walked into the most protected building in America and told the truth. Not for applause, not for victory, but because silence would have made her complicit. And America, broken and burning, finally listened. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to change everything. As the last candle flickered against the stone steps of the Capitol and Jasmine disappeared into the shadows of the columns, the country was left not with answers, but with a question burning like a wound. What do we really want justice to look like? Justice for most was an idea, an abstraction painted in textbooks and echoed through campaign slogans. But for Jasmine Crockett, justice had always been personal. It had a face. It had a body count. It had a time of death on a coroner's chart that no apology could erase. And in that moment, as the crowds dispersed and the country held its breath, the real question emerged. What happens after the applause dies? After the cameras turn off? After the hashtag trends and fades? You see, justice without memory is performance, and America had become addicted to performance. But Jasmine never came for performance. She came for reckoning, and that's what she left behind. In the days that followed, the backlash was swift and vicious. Political operatives branded her a radical with a martyr complex. Commentators questioned her patriotism, her upbringing, her tone. Police unions threatened walkouts in 3 states. Anonymous letters arrived at her office, one quoting scripture, another quoting bullets. Yet none of it surprised her. She had never been allowed to speak without consequence. But what cut deeper than threats was the silence from those who should have stood beside her. The moderates who privately agreed, the officials who whispered, "You're brave," off camera, the leaders who calculated their next run while she bled in real time. And that was the lesson. Justice has no momentum without sacrifice. If you want change, you must be willing to be devoured by it. Jasmine knew this truth like a second skin. She had seen it before, etched into the tear-streaked faces of grieving mothers, echoed in the shallow graves of boys whose only crime was matching a description. It was never enough to be right. You had to endure being right while the world told you you were wrong. And yet, she pressed forward. Because someone had to be the bridge between pain and power. Someone had to name what others were too afraid to see. In Ohio, the mother of Malik Daniels, who had testified in tears, was invited to her son's old school to speak. She walked through the hallways he used to run through barefoot, now lined with murals of civil rights leaders, and her child's face among them. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just whispered, "Maybe now he's more than a mistake." That was the cost. That was the quiet price of truth. In Los Angeles, a police officer anonymously sent a letter to Jasmine's office. He wrote, "I don't agree with everything you said, but when you looked into that camera and said, 'We're not here to worship men with guns,' I finally saw my badge differently. I don't want to be feared anymore. I want to be trusted. Thank you for the mirror." That was the reach. That was the ripple no vote could measure. But the lesson was not just about policing. It was about the dangerous seduction of silence, the way systems condition good people to say nothing, to protect their careers, their comfort, their illusions. Jasmine had stood not to accuse every officer, but to indict a culture that rewards complicity, a culture that convinces us neutrality is nobility. But the truth? Neutrality in the face of suffering is cowardice. Her courage forced a nation to confront its favorite lie. That law and order always serve the same master. They don't. Law protects power, order protects comfort, but justice, real justice, protects the vulnerable. That's why it's always messy. That's why it always looks like protest before it looks like policy. And Jasmine's lesson, her burden, her weapon, was that the only way to bring about real, lasting reform was to be willing to stand alone in the fire and not flinch. She taught us that dignity doesn't mean silence, that fury can be righteous, that grief is political when it is ignored. And most of all, she reminded the nation that moral clarity is not measured by polls or party lines, but by what you do when no one is clapping. Weeks after the hearing, a teenage girl in Tulsa sent Jasmine a letter. She wrote, "I watched you stand up to all of them. I want to be a lawyer now, not because I like rules, but because I want to make new ones." Jasmine framed that letter and placed it beside the names of the 12 children whose photos she had once projected on the committee wall. Not as trophies, as compass points, because the human lesson was not only about injustice. It was about what we owe each other. We owe the truth. We owe outrage when silence is deadly. We owe protection that doesn't come with a price tag or a color code. And we owe every child the right to grow old. For Jasmine Crockett, the greatest tragedy was not that young black boys were dying. It was that so few people found it tragic. That indifference is what she shattered. That blindness is what she lit on fire. And as the months passed, reform bills began to surface in state legislatures. They didn't carry her name. They didn't make headlines. But inside each proposal, better training protocols, accountability incentives, community first response models were fingerprints of the fire she had started. Quiet fingerprints, but fingerprints nonetheless. Because the lesson, the real lesson of Jasmine Crockett wasn't about a courtroom or a committee hearing. It was about what happens when one woman refuses to accept that silence is the cost of survival. It was about what courage looks like when it's inconvenient. It was about how truth, when spoken with fire and purpose, can survive every attempt to bury it. And it was about how a nation fractured by fear could begin, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, to heal. Not through unity for the sake of unity, but through accountability for the sake of humanity. That is the legacy Jasmine Crockett etched into history, not in marble, not in law, but in the eyes of every person who watched her stand up when it would have been easier to sit down. She didn't win a vote. She won something bigger. She made the nation feel again. And that is how change begins. And while Jasmine's voice echoed through the cracks of a shaken nation, her final message wasn't just a verdict. It was a call to the living, a challenge to the comfortable, a dare to those still watching from behind the glass. This is not the end. This is the ignition point. If you're angry, stay angry. If you're heartbroken, don't just cry, move. Speak in rooms where silence used to live. Challenge the laws that shield the powerful and abandon the powerless. Ask your officials where they stand when the cameras are off. Demand body cams. Demand civilian oversight. Demand that justice stop kneeling before uniforms and start walking beside citizens. Because nothing changes unless pressure breaks the mold. Jasmine stood alone so that you wouldn't have to. Now the question isn't what she did, it's what you will do. Will you scroll past this moment, or will you rise with it? The future isn't waiting, it's already watching. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.